August, 1914. Northern Belgium. The sound of marching boots echoes across empty fields. Orders were clear. Advance forward. Yet, confusion looms. Soldiers move, unaware of the trap that awaits. The summer of 1914 had brought tension across Europe to a boiling point. Germany's plans for a swift victory against France relied on precise coordination. Belgium, a neutral country, found itself suddenly caught in the path of advancing armies. On the Belgian frontier, small towns and rivers formed natural defensive lines. The Belgian army, though disciplined, was small and poorly equipped compared to the German war machine. In the early days of August, German orders demanded rapid movement. The goal was to sweep through Belgium, bypassing strongpoints, and strike deep into France before reinforcements could arrive. The German command assumed that the Belgian army would either surrender or retreat immediately. They underestimated both the courage and the determination of the defenders. Belgian troops, aware of the strategic importance of cities like Liège, concentrated along fortifications. The towns were quiet in the morning mist, but tension hung heavy in the air. Soldiers cleaned their rifles, adjusted uniforms, and prepared ammunition. Officers consulted maps and issued marching orders. Civilians watched from windows, silent witnesses to a gathering storm. Yet behind the German lines, miscommunication began to emerge. Orders issued from Berlin were rigid. Corps were instructed to advance according to fixed schedules. Field commanders on the ground had little freedom to adjust. Terrain was ignored. Rivers, forests, and roads slowed progress, creating long columns of troops. Units became separated. Dispatches were delayed. The plan that seemed so perfect on paper now clashed with the realities of the Belgian countryside. By mid-morning, the first encounters occurred. Belgian outposts spotted German soldiers moving through the countryside. Skirmishes erupted. Machine guns and artillery opened fire. Panic and fear spread among some German units. Still, orders to advance remained. Soldiers pressed on despite the chaos, unknowingly moving into zones already compromised by enemy resistance. The stage was set. German units, bound by unyielding commands, marched into a network of resistance points. Roads narrowed, forests restricted movement, and rivers became obstacles. Communication lines failed. Units waited for signals that never came. Soldiers were trapped not by the enemy alone but by the very orders that were supposed to guarantee victory. As the morning turned into afternoon, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The German army's rigid schedules collided with the unpredictable Belgian defense. Troop columns became strung out. Officers realized too late that units were cut off from each other. Ambushes sprang up at every bend. Soldiers had no cover and little awareness of the terrain. Panic spread. The orders dictated continued movement. Retreat was forbidden. Flanking maneuvers were impossible without explicit permission from higher command. Communication was fragmented. Couriers struggled to traverse contested roads. The soldiers at the front had no idea how deep the trap was. Some units attempted to dig in, forming temporary defensive positions. Artillery tried to provide cover, but the timing was off. Shells fell short or overshot. Meanwhile, Belgian defenders exploited every advantage. They knew the land intimately. Forests provided concealment. Bridges and narrow roads became choke points. Even small groups of troops could stall entire columns. German soldiers found themselves pinned against obstacles. Attempts to regroup were often met with fire from hidden positions. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the chaos. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. Soldiers were hungry, thirsty, and disoriented. Messages from headquarters arrived sporadically. Many units were unaware that neighboring battalions had been stopped or destroyed. Some officers tried to override the central commands. Others hesitated, fearing punishment for disobedience. The inflexibility of the orders turned what might have been a tactical maneuver into a strategic disaster. The battlefield became a maze. Smoke from burning villages and artillery filled the air. Horses panicked. Wagons blocked narrow roads. Men tripped over debris, struggled through mud, and attempted to assist wounded comrades. Each movement was dictated by orders that no longer matched reality. By evening, the German army found itself in a web of its own making. What had begun as an organized advance now resembled chaos. Units were surrounded, cut off, and immobilized. The Belgian defenders, though smaller in number, used their knowledge and flexibility to outmaneuver the larger force. Soldiers began to understand the grim truth: they were trapped. Their own command structure had become the enemy. Nightfall brought silence, punctuated by distant gunfire and the groans of the wounded. Thousands of soldiers were immobilized. Supplies were low. Artillery could no longer reach all positions. Attempts to retreat were met with confusion and fire. The army that had advanced confidently in the morning now faced destruction by both circumstance and command. Field officers tried desperate measures. Signals were sent in every direction. Runners sprinted through mud and darkness to relay messages. Yet confusion persisted. Some units abandoned their positions. Others held out until morning, only to find themselves isolated and surrounded. The rigid timetable imposed by the German High Command had led entire divisions into positions where escape was nearly impossible. The casualties were immense. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Cannons fell silent, abandoned by exhausted crews. Soldiers who survived wandered through forests and villages, lost and unsure of where to regroup. Panic and despair replaced discipline. The orders that had seemed so precise now served as chains, binding men to a fate they could not control. The Belgian army, smaller but adaptive, continued to pressure the trapped units. Skirmishes intensified. Every attempt to break through was met with organized resistance. By dawn, the German army was a shadow of its former strength. Communications were fractured. Morale collapsed. The battlefields were littered with abandoned equipment, broken wagons, and the bodies of men who had followed orders to the letter. This event, though overshadowed by later battles, demonstrated a harsh lesson. The most disciplined army could fall victim to its own rigidity. The chain of command, meant to enforce efficiency, became the mechanism of disaster. And yet, few outside Belgium would remember the faces of those who perished. Few would recall the days when orders were as deadly as bullets. The battlefield fell silent. Smoke lingered over shattered roads and scorched fields. Trees were scarred by artillery, fences lay broken, and buildings stood half-ruined. Soldiers had vanished. Some had fled into forests, others were carried off by medics or captured. Wagons, rifles, and abandoned equipment remained as the only witnesses. Yet the men themselves were gone. Their faces, once alive with fear and determination, disappeared into the fog of memory. Villages that had once teemed with life were empty. Smoke curled from broken chimneys. Streets were silent. Civilians emerged cautiously, discovering the remnants of battle. Horses wandered freely, dragging broken carts. Dogs howled in the distance. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, observing the absence left by those who had marched, fought, and perished. Time passed, but the story remained muted. Reports recorded the movements of divisions and the casualties in numbers, yet the individuality of the soldiers faded. Letters and diaries, the voices of those trapped by rigid orders, were scattered, lost, or destroyed. Maps and dispatches preserved the sequence of events, but they could not carry the cries of fear, the fleeting courage, or the silent prayers of men who faced a trap of their own army's design. The rigidity of command had been cruel. Orders, once clear and confident, had become invisible walls around men who could not retreat or maneuver. Thousands followed instructions to the letter, and thousands paid with their lives. Yet outside these immediate events, the world moved on. Newspapers reported victories elsewhere. Armies celebrated their conquests. The trapped soldiers became statistics, their existence reduced to footnotes in broader histories. Over the years, historians pieced together fragments of what had occurred. They reconstructed maps, analyzed telegrams, and studied after-action reports. They described the logistical failures, the immobility, the chaos. But the individual faces, the moments of hope extinguished in the mud, the whispered instructions that came too late, all were gone. Memory itself seemed to retreat. What remained was the evidence of absence: empty roads, abandoned rifles, broken wagons. The men were present only in shadow, and even those shadows faded with each passing year. Belgium recovered. Roads were repaired. Bridges rebuilt. Fields grew crops once more. Life returned to villages that had witnessed the passage of a doomed army. Yet the men who had been trapped by their own orders were not remembered in streets or monuments. Their names faded from lists. Their voices disappeared. Even in military records, they were often merged into faceless units, numbers instead of people. Silence became the sole guardian of their story. The army that had marched with confidence into a trap became a ghost. Orders had guided them, dictated their every step, and finally vanished into history with them. The landscape endured. The rivers flowed. Forests grew. But the men were gone. Belgium moved on. Europe moved on. And the army, once whole and disciplined, became nothing more than a memory of absence, forgotten in time. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.